BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Good morning. I'm on the edge of the River Otter Estuary in Devon, not far from Budleigh-Salterton. Here, the clock's been turned back more than 200 years and the landscape radically altered to cope with the climate change challenges of the present and the future.
Are those salt marsh plants over there?
Yeah, those are Salicornia, so saltwort, so that's colonised in this last year since we did the breach, and you've also got sea purslane and sea aster and other things.
Showing me the newly created Lower Otter Nature Reserve are John Varley and Dr Sam Bridgewater from Clinton Devon Estates, the landowners here.
Since we flooded with saltwater for the first time, tail end of 23, all the original vegetation kind of died off, got a lot of mud being deposited, and now we're getting the salt marsh plants coming in.
Dr Sam Bridgewater is Clinton Devon Estates Director of Environmental Strategy and Evidence, and John Varley is their Chief Executive.
This was 55 hectares of English pastoral landscape, well loved by everybody and farmed. And today this is some of the prime habitat you can get in England. It's salt marsh and mudflats, and it's over the next few generations it's going to get better and better. Back in the early 1800s, we were having a little difficulty with Napoleon, potentially sailing up and down the English Channel, blockading this country. So landowners were encouraged to bring more land into production in the early 1800s so we could be more self-sufficient. And Lord Rolle, who owned this land at the time, was encouraged by somebody called James Green, the county engineer for Devon, to take over 160 acres of salt marsh and mudflats and convert it into agricultural land. And ever since then, strangely enough, the river and nature have tried to get back to what they were.
To our right then, there are some steep hills dropping down into the estuary, slightly wooded. And then as we turn round to our left and look into the sunshine, squint slightly into the watery winter sunshine, can see the mirror-like water, and then in the far distance is the shingle bar that's at Budleigh-Salterton. Is that right?
That's right, Budleigh-Salterton.
How often did this land flood? I mean, in recent years?
It floods on an irregular basis, rains in the Blackdown Hills, tanks down the valley and eventually ends up here. And the water gets trapped behind all the existing infrastructure. There's a road that crosses the floodplain, there's the embankment, and it can't really get out to sea. The embankment is starting to fail. It's 200 years old. It actually first failed 2 decades after it was first built in about 1840. It failed catastrophically in the 1950s, and they had to build a railway to actually repair it. It almost failed again in 2018 and 2020. So really, we knew, whether we liked it or not, the sea was coming up this valley. And if you consider climate change and the fact that we're locked into a metre of sea level rise, then it's a question of what do? You can do nothing and wait for the inevitable to happen, or you can try and manage that process and make the best of it. And that's really what we try to do.
So take me through the various elements of how you've changed the landscape here, what you had to do.
In essence, it's quite simple, I suppose. So it involved putting a breach, a 70-metre breach in the embankment close to the estuary mouth to allow the sea up and down the valley so it can ebb and flow as it once did. That embankment is also part of the southwest coast path, and we wanted to maintain access. There's now a footbridge that runs over that breach, so it's still open for access. There's about 3 kilometres of pathway that we're able to improve with this project. If you look up the valley a little bit, you'll see there's a road bridge. Now, there was a road that comes across that valley. It was flooded on a regular basis. We've been able to raise it, so businesses and the homes on the other side of the valley remain connected to the community. The final thing, across the water there, you can see about 10,000 trees have been planted. It used to be a municipal tip, and many of our estuaries across the nation have these tips in them. It's an environmental liability. What we've been able to do is to reduce the environmental risk, to cap it properly, it was never capped in the first place, and to arm it around the sides.
There was also the far from small matter of relocating Budleigh-Salterton's frequently flooded cricket ground. Perhaps unsurprisingly, given the scale of the project, local opinion was sharply divided. There was even a Stop the Swamp campaign at one stage. John Varley from Clinton Devon Estates.
We took it on the chin and we spent a lot of time trying to engage. It's not about telling people, it's about making them feel part of it. It was about getting local councillors and other amenity groups to actually lead some of the engagement teams. And it was difficult. It split views because change is hard, especially change on this scale. At the end of the day, it was interesting to see how people's mindsets have changed since we've delivered it. When it went to the local council, all councillors voted in favour of it because of that hard work that was put in. It took years.
The reason that the embankment was built during the Napoleonic War era was, as you said, food security. Food security is an issue that definitely hasn't gone away. So how did you justify taking this land out of food production and turning it into salt marsh instead?
From the estate's perspective, it wasn't that difficult. Obviously, for the individual farmers concerned, we had some interesting and in some cases difficult conversations because of what they were used to doing and their farming models. We were able, because we were an estate, to be able to offer alternatives and better land. But I'm not saying it wasn't an easy conversation with those invested in managing and producing food here. But if you take a long-term view about land use, this was salt marsh, it was mudflats, it was going to become that anyway at some stage in the future, maybe 50, 100 years' time. And so we were helping that transition in an ordered way and working with farmers to help them with their businesses.
Clinton Devon Estates had been investigating options for the Otter Estuary for years. Eventually, the Environment Agency joined as a partner for the project and one of the major funders. The total bill was £26 million. Dan Boswell is a project manager for the Environment Agency.
Climate change and sea level rise is something that is happening. It's measurable. Somebody who's born today will see something over a metre of sea level rise during their lifetime. So our coasts are coming under increasing pressure. We need to make our coastlines adaptable and resilient to this change. This is very much a project aligned to the Environment Agency's core aims of creating a better place for people and the environment. The Environment Agency is very keen to make our coastal communities more resilient to rising sea levels and also to compensate for losses of important intertidal habitats such as salt marsh and mudflat that we're losing around this country nationally.
The Pebblebed Heaths Conservation Trust looks after the newly created habitat. I met Reserves Manager Kim Strawbridge by the water's edge.
If we consider things like climate change, we're going to suffer from something called coastal squeeze. So those mudflats and salt marshes are going to get squeezed as the tide rises up against hard infrastructure. So whether that's sea defences or harbour walls, things like that. Here, by creating this habitat, we've got the ability for those habitats to move. So as the sea level rises over time, it can move up the valley and the whole site can kind of change and adapt, and the species can follow that as well. So here we really have got an opportunity to kind of create a really important stepping stone, but also something that can transition into the future as well.
But I guess by the same token, in the act of creating that salt marsh habitat, you're squeezing the farmland habitat.
Yeah, so there is a trade-off. There's always a trade-off. We've got a limited amount of land in this country, obviously. But with salt marsh, it really, really is a priority habitat. It's not only important for mitigation and for the wildlife that's here, but also things like carbon sequestration and all those things as well. So I think by looking more broadly at the landscape, we can look at how we can tweak our farming practices elsewhere to make sure we still are getting the maximum value in terms of agriculture from the other land that's in the valley.
Across the water, there's a big hump of a hill that rises up with some fir trees on the top of it. And on this side of the water, we're behind a farm. There are some trees planted behind us. I can see a few rose hips.
This here, just behind us, is a small plantation that was planted as part of the project as mitigation for habitat that was lost, during the construction of the reserve as it is now. So I'm Rick Lockwood. I'm the ranger here. I've been in post about a year and a half. We're at the northern end of the reserve at the moment, a place called Big Bank, and there's lots of wintering wildfowl here. So we've got teal, which you may be able to hear in the background whistling. There's widgeon, and then numbers of shelduck, We've got over 1,000 wildfowl on the site at the moment, and also wading birds, things like curlew oystercatcher, redshank.
And you've had some special and unusual wildlife visitors. Tell me about the ospreys.
Yeah, so through autumn migration periods, we've had ospreys coming through, which has created a real buzz. So you could just be down here, out for a nice stroll with your family, walking the dog, and you might just catch a glimpse of an osprey popping down to catch a mullet. They're obviously not here now because it's out of season.
Yeah, ospreys are fantastic birds. There are a lot of other special birds that have also visited since the reserve was flooded with seawater. So we've had things like spoonbill. Kingfisher is regularly sighted here, and everyone loves to see a kingfisher. It's one of the main things that, you know, members of the public relish in seeing as they're walking around the reserve.
And do you see more people walking along here as a result of the change? I mean, beneath our feet there's a wide surfaced path.
Yeah, certainly. For me, that's one of the big gains. These are public footpaths that have always been here, but they were a little bit harder to navigate and people didn't necessarily know where they were. And now it's much more obvious. We regularly see people up here that have mobility challenges. So we'll see people in trampers or even standard wheelchairs, families with pushchairs and toddlers coming up here, which you didn't really see before. Local running groups use it, local health walking groups use it. So as well as an increase in sort of footfall, it's also the kinds of people that can now get in and enjoy it that couldn't previously.